Hi, I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. Today I want to talk to you about a little known piece of equipment. It's maybe not little known, but maybe little used piece of equipment, at least up here in the Northeast. And there's a lot to be said for using this piece of equipment to help keep the hive warm. What I'm going to be talking about is the slatted rack, which is used to separate the entrance of the hive from the rest of the brood chamber. Let's think about it for a second. The colony is needing to maintain its temperature throughout the year, particularly in the winter, and times when they're also very vulnerable is in the spring when they're rearing a lot of brood. In the summer, the hives are looking to maintain temperature by doing a lot of fanning to increase and circulate air through the hive. They also do that to create a current of air to cure honey, to drive off moisture from the hive. So there is actually a lot to be said about using a piece of equipment at the bottom of the hive which can help them do that. It also has some advantages, perhaps, in reducing swarming. So let's have a look. We reduce the entrances of the hive to whether we're using a turnaround entrance reduced with tiny little slits in it, or whether we use sticks like this just to reduce the entrance. Now, in doing so, that minimizes the loss of heat through the bottom of the hive and also is going to reduce the draft or air circulating around in the hive. And this might be particularly the case when we're using something like a screened bottom board. When we have the tray in here, and particularly when that's out, that can cause a fair draft at the bottom of the hive. And so if we just look under that, see the screen would allow for the movement of quite a bit of air. Now, I'm very happy that these things work very well as I use them at the moment. But the slatted rack may have some extra advantages. What the slatted rack does is it separates the entrance of the hive, where air can come in, whether it's got a small entrance or a large entrance, from the bottom of the brood chamber up here. So what it is, and I've got one in place here, but here's one we have a look at. There's a board here which keeps the entrance draft right away from the brood, so the draft is at least six inches away from the bottom of the brood comb. But also what it does is it gives the bees clustering space. So picture the combs are hanging down here, and instead of them just hanging down at the bottom of the comb here and the bottom of the hive with only 3/4 of an inch to the bottom of the hive where the coldest air is, what we have now is an additional 2 inches between the bottom of the hive and the bottom of the frame. Now that's going to do a couple of things. First of all, it's going to keep moving air from being too close to the bottom of those brood frames. Air is a very poor conductor of heat, so by having a space of 2 to 3 inches below the bottom of the brood frames, we have an area of, in the wintertime, relatively still air, which is going to act like a bit of an insulator at the bottom of the hive. Hives don't lose a great deal of heat from the bottom of the hive in the wintertime unless it's really windy, but there's some advantages there. But what it can also do is it gives space below those brood frames for bees to cluster, both on the wood here and below the wood underneath and on the frames. This provides area instead of the bees covering the front of the hive, what's called bearding or hanging from the bottom board there. Bees will do that particularly in muggy conditions, and they'll hang around outside the hive in order to clear space from the entrance so that a better flow of air can take place blowing through the hive. Because during the hot, muggy weather, it may only be in the high 70s or something, but during high humidity conditions, you'll see bearding in front of the hive. And this will be because the bees are trying to clear space from between the combs and at the bottom of the combs to allow air to move through the hive more freely. Well, this slatted rack will assist with that, giving them more area in which they can be bees fanning the bottoms of those frames to create the air current in one side out the other. So this is going to help them keep the hive cool in the summer. And in the winter, it's going to help them keep it warm because of more of an insulating air layer at the bottom. One other major advantage of using the slatted rack is particularly in the spring. At the spring, the hive is really concerned here in Maine with maintaining the temperature of that brood cluster area, and it can only expand the brood chamber downwards as it's able to heat up the bottom parts of the hive. So let's have a look inside the hive and see how, just sort of picture how that happens. So we've got the screen bottom board right here, only about an inch below the frames. And picture the cluster of bees on these frames trying to keep that warm. With air coming in the entrance, there's cool air moving very close to the hive, even if we have that tray in. And what I've found on many occasions like that is that the queen will, on let's say a single brood chamber here, just to keep it simple, the queen's only laying down to about this area because it's cold down here, and they're having difficulty, unless we've got a big cluster, having difficulty keeping the rest of that part of the frame warm. That's the last part that they fill up. They'll fill up the brood all the way across, but they'll be slow in pushing down. This is particularly the case when we've got two-story brood chamber, but that's a different story. The slatted rack's not going to help much with the two-story hive initially if they're still up in the upper brood chamber. But what the slatted rack will do is it will put that colder layer of air much lower down in the hive. So let's put that slatted rack in. So instead of being about an inch from the cold bottom part of the hive, now it's about 3.5 inches from the bottom part of the hive. That relatively, if they're not fanning, this is still a relatively still layer of air, and that means the queen will now start laying further and further and further down without getting into that cold layer of air down below. So the slatted rack can increase the production of brood, particularly in the early spring. In the summer, the same thing could be said. If the entrance is wide open, the queen will tend not to use that bottom inch or so of the brood chamber, and this allows for a bigger use of comb space for the queen to lay. This can have a knock-on effect on giving more egg-laying room, which has a knock-on effect on swarming. So if there's more room for her to lay eggs, this postpones the urge to swarm. But it does something else. It allows the bees to cluster down below when the brood chamber is relatively full. So if one of the things that drives swarming is the brood chamber of the colony being overcrowded. And that can be overcrowded with things like honey taking up space for the queen to lay, but it can also be overcrowded in terms of too many bees just getting in the way. Too many young bees have just emerged and they all want to look after the brood. They're immediately close to the brood chamber area. If they have somewhere to cluster close to the brood chamber area but not actually in it, this helps to depopulate the brood chamber area and can assist in reducing the incidence of swarming. So there are some extra advantages to this slatted rack. So for temperature control in the hive and for the possible reduction of swarming in the hive as well. Now, the one thing I don't need, I've got 100 and some odd hives, and that can go up to 200 or so in the different times of the year. The last thing I need is another piece of equipment. And having to have 100 or more of these is just going to be probably outweigh the benefits that I would get from it. But for the hobbyist, I think that might be a different story. It's not a particularly expensive piece of equipment. It's certainly an optional extra, but it might be something worth considering. If you want to help maintain the temperature, keep it warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer, and the possibility of helping reduce some of that swarming inclination by keeping the brood chamber less heavily populated. I hope you found that interesting. It's a piece of equipment that you can find in most beekeeping supply stores like my own, but it's, as I say, it's not something I use on a large scale, but I know a lot of folks that do find it very, very helpful, and they swear by them. So if you found that helpful, maybe you want to give it a try. If you did like that, please press that subscribe button and join now. I've got over 1,000 subscribers, so thank you all very much for joining me for that. If you did like that, press that subscribe button, press the like button, share the video with your friends. Maybe we can help more people improve their beekeeping. I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.